This is a racist government. We've got to be clear about this. Got to be blunt about it. Now, the instant backlash against saying this goes something like this. How can you possibly say that? This is a diverse government with people hailing from all different backgrounds. We've got the first Prime Minister of Asian heritage. Labour have never managed that. And the Home Secretary herself, Suella Braverman, her family were expelled from Idi Amin's Uganda. Now, we've got to be clear about this being a racist government in what it does and what it says. Now, to flesh this whole argument out, given the government would point to the diversity within their ranks, let's listen to Baroness Sayeeda Warsi, the most prominent conservative Muslim politician, and she's actually the former chair of the Conservative Party. Let's just hear what she said.
I asked this question with a bit of discomfort. It's certainly not one I could answer, but is Suella Braverman's own ethnicity pertinent here? Do you think that a white Home Secretary would have been able to make these comments with a degree of impunity?
I don't think any of my colleagues can use the pigment in the skin as some sort of a defense mechanism to say they're not racist. You know, brown people can be racist too. And if you're
are you calling
your language,
are you calling the Home Secretary racist?
I am calling her rhetoric racist. I am. And I'm supporting the letters which call her rhetoric racist. And I think I say that as somebody who was subjected to racism growing up, you know, in the 70s and 80s. This is not a term that I use loosely, and it's certainly not a term that I use easily when I talk about another woman of colour, another parliamentarian of colour. But I think that somehow we have to call this out, you know, just because people of all colours and all backgrounds and all sexualities can be homophobic, and people of all backgrounds, you know, sexualities and colours can be racist. We only have to look across at what happened in places like Burma, where, you know, people kind of thought Buddhists couldn't be violent, and then we saw what happened to the Rohingya community. We look at racism existing today in Modi's India, and the violence that minorities, including Christians and Dalits and Muslims, are subjected to show that there is just clear racism at play. And so I just think it is important for us to call this out, and for us to say that just because you are a politician of colour does not mean that you can engage in language which a politician who's white would not be considered acceptable. That language would not be considered acceptable for them to use. But also remember, Jim, she's the Home Secretary. You know, she should be using her words carefully. She should be measured. Her policy making should be rooted in evidence. She should be thoughtful. She's responsible for the security of our country. We need a grown-up in that role. You know, we certainly don't need somebody who's trying to, you know, perform some sort of Trump tribute act.
Absolute bang on. And I think that really illustrates why representation isn't ever enough. And doesn't, you know, for example, Margaret Thatcher, did that hail the end of sexism and misogyny in modern Britain? Clearly not. Now, just to get a bit more background about Sayeeda Warsi, who I think is a fascinating politician, I've interviewed myself before. She's previously called on the Conservatives to launch a full independent inquiry into Islamophobia into the party. She said previously said Tories were stuck with a political strategy that amounted to little more than fuck the Muslims. As she's previously said, Islamophobia is very widespread in the Conservative Party. She said it's present at all levels of the party, from top to bottom. And she said that the Tories' own campaigns included anti-Muslim messages. Who can forget, of course, the virulently Islamophobic campaign that Zach Goldsmith, who stood against Sadiq Khan in the 2016 mayoral election, the virulently Islamophobic campaign that Zach Goldsmith ran. It was disgusting and frankly in the gutter, but she's been ignored. I mean, she previously told me when I interviewed her, she said about Michael Gove, I'm not the only one to raise concerns about Michael Gove. Ken Clarke has spoken about it, even his friends close to him. Even David Cameron has spoken about concerns about the way he views the world and the way he views certain communities. She was talking about his views on Islam, on Muslims in the Western world, and believed that he had extreme views on that, and he'd helped radicalise David Cameron. So I think it's important to set that context, because we are going to talk, obviously, we are talking about Suella Braverman in part, but it's so easy to turn Suella Braverman into this bogey individual, this bogey person, and you know, where we can just go, well, look at this pantomime villain, and stick all the problems we have with the Conservatives on her, when actually this is a systemic problem. And the case about Islamophobia is just one particular issue. Another, of course, is Windrush, where the hostile environment, which the likes of Theresa May designed, ended up with black Britons, Windrush Britons, people who lived here for decades, denied medical care, stripped of their rights and deported from their own country. That is where the Tories' racism, of course, has led. So I think that context is important, because this didn't just suddenly appear from, because Suella Braverman is so crude and vulgar, if you like, in the way she speaks about these issues. The danger is we forget. And Theresa May is an example of someone who lots of liberals sort of try and rehabilitate, erase what she did. In the same way that American liberals of a certain type do about George W. Bush, because they were like, well, look how vulgar and crude Donald Trump is. George W. Bush didn't send vulgar tweets. As though it's all vibes rather than substance, and substance matters. Now, this week, Sayeeda Warsi told the BBC that Braverman's racist rhetoric was putting British Asian families at risk. It was emboldening racists. She's actually gone to the point where she's actually told her father not to walk home from the mosque. Just put that in context. We're talking about a Conservative politician telling her own father, for his own safety, not to walk home by himself from his mosque because of the rhetoric of a politician from her own political party. It is difficult to put into words just how unbelievably diabolical that is. Now, ahead of announcing, as we know, just to put in context, Braverman said, in advance of a new police task force to tackle grooming gangs, she said groups of vulnerable white English girls were being pursued and raped and drugged and harmed by gangs of British Pakistani men who've worked in child abuse networks. The sort of rhetoric you hear from the British National Party, which goes against the evidence, which shows, according to the Home Office's own statistics, that around 92% of grooming gangs are made up of white men. There's no evidence, actually, in that report to show overrepresentation of minorities. So what Suella Braverman did is zone in on a particular demographic, as though that lies at the heart of child abuse, which is obviously whipping up racism, making people think that Britons of Pakistani heritage and extraction are somehow specific threats to white girls. That's the picture which has been spun. And that is why the likes of Sayeeda Warsi are telling her father not to walk home alone from the mosque. Now, as she said in The Guardian this week, Braverman is a trained barrister. If somebody who is trained to be an advocate cannot communicate on serious issues in a thoughtful, reasonable, evidence-based way, that's an issue of incompetence. Whether this consistent use of racist rhetoric or strategy and competence, however, doesn't matter. Both show she's not fit to hold high office. Why not both? Incompetent and also using racist rhetoric. For clear electoral reasons. The strategy of this government is to tap into racism and bigotry for electoral reasons. That's just what the Tories have always done. They did it centuries ago with Jews fleeing Eastern Europe. They did that with legislation in the early 20th century. Jews fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe, particularly in Tsarist Russia and the lands which it ruled. They've done it previously with Windrush Britons. They've done it with Asians. They're doing it all over again. I mean, clearly, the reason they're doing it is because when people are thinking about refugees, migrants, Muslims, Britons of Bangladeshi background, they're not thinking about the injustices the Conservatives are responsible for. They're not thinking about how the public services of this country have been cut to the bone. They're not thinking about how their wages have been suppressed because of Tory economic policy. They're not thinking about the tax dodgers who are avoiding taxes on an industrial scale. Not thinking about the bankers who plunged this country into economic calamity and then forced millions of people to pick up a tab for a crisis they had absolutely nothing to do with whatsoever. They're not thinking of the scandals that have enveloped the Conservatives over and over again. They're not thinking about how workers lack basic rights in the workplace. They're not thinking about how the National Health Service has been brought to its knees by Tory policy. They're not thinking about how per pupil funding in our education system has been slashed, an act of vandalism on the future generations of the people of this country. They're not thinking, about these bread and butter issues that define our lives. Instead, they're getting angry with people who are migrants, refugees, or people who are Britons of particular heritage. And that is why it's so important that Sayeeda Warsi has spoken out so eloquently and so courageously, I would say, on this particular issue, because this isn't just about Suella Braverman. It is about a political party which uses and fosters racism in order to deflect people's anger, justifiable anger, from all the problems that exist in society at all the wrong targets. And until more people call that out, then I'm afraid to say that this country will head even further towards the abyss than it's already managed under 13 years of Conservative rule. Please like, subscribe, and do support us on patreon.com/OwenJones84. See you in a bit.